Hi guys, this is Spartan 071 from Halo Phoenix Fire Team, and I am currently working on a foam air assault helmet. This is what I got so far. I use the PEP files, but I modify them to work for foam. When it comes to helmets, I like using craft foam because it's thinner than the EVA and it's a little bit easier to work with and get more details out of. When it comes to the PEP files, mostly what I do is I strip away all the little tiny thin bits that you don't need because they're just from paper and you don't really transfer them over to foam very well. As you can see, I've made some decent progress on this one so far. I'm working on this one for a friend of mine, which we're currently in the middle of a mass build. We're building about 8 Spartans for Phoenix Comic-Con coming up in May. I'll do my best to try and show you the process I go through when I am building this helmet, at least some of it. This is the first video I've ever done for building cosplay stuff, so bear with me a little bit. But let's get right to it. So, next section I'm working on is building out the back of the crown of the helmet. I like to start with this because if you try and build the sides and bottom and what I call the jawbone, the part that covers your mouth, first, getting the glue gun up in there to attach pieces becomes a real pain. So I try and work from the top down. The next part I'm going to be doing, like I said, is right here, and I've already cut the stencils out. This is the next piece. I'm going to cut the detail out of there real quick, but as you can see, I use a cutting mat here, and I prefer an X-Acto. The X-Acto gives you a lot of control, especially if you have a good handle. Scissors do have their place for cutting out the bigger stencils that have long straight lines and things like that. I also make it out of cardstock when I print the stencils rather than regular paper because they hold up better for tracing onto foam. They don't flex and move out of your way, things like that. So all I do is I just cut along the lines here to cut the pieces out. Get this guy real quick. I'll do my best to narrate as I go through. Like I said, I've never really done this before, but I will try my best. You can buy this craft foam that I use at Hobby Lobby, Michael's, Joann's. I like buying it at Hobby Lobby because the value you get out of it, I get a big sheet like this for $1.30. It comes in a bunch of colors. I prefer anything pretty much other than black because black is hard to see your pencil lines on when you trace your pieces. Joann's usually sells the sheets, the regular size sheets that are about the size of a sheet of paper, like this, for anywhere from $1 to $2 a sheet. Michael's is usually $1 a sheet. So let's trace this guy out, and I will show you how we attach it and also how to do undercuts on these. Undercuts are important because you need to make curves or angles out of a solid piece of foam rather than cutting it apart and making seams. Seams are not bad. A lot of people think that, oh, the seams, they're going to show up through everything and it's going to look terrible. This is not true. You can actually work around seams quite a bit. Now, eliminating seams from the beginning through careful planning does make your life a lot easier down the road. But you can get rid of most seams with a little bit of sandpaper, a little bit of trimming. You can use scissors or an X-Acto depending on the seam. Something you're going to kind of have to experiment with yourself, as this is not something you can learn entirely online. You have to get your hands into it and try and work with it yourself so you understand how it goes. So I've traced out this piece twice because there's a left and a right. One's just a mirror image of the other. And now it's time to cut these guys out and see if we can get them attached. When I use the X-Acto to cut these guys out, I try to cut past the line in order to be sure that the corners connect. When the corners don't connect, you get little tears from pulling the piece out, and they get in your way. They're more just an irritant than anything else, but doing this, you can kind of eliminate them from the get-go. So I got a nice clean line there. I have a good sharp X-Acto blade. You're going to want to buy a lot of these if you're doing this with an X-Acto, or you're going to have to learn how to sharpen your blades. I prefer not to sharpen them as a personal preference. I mean, I know how to sharpen them. I know how to sharpen knives and things like that. However, it can be tedious, and you don't always get the best result sharpening the blades as you do with a fresh one every time. Now, when I say a fresh one every time, depending on the foam you're cutting, will determine how fast the blade dulls. If you are using the thick EVA foam, the floor mats that you can get at Harbor Freight or Walmart or Costco, there's a lot of different places you can get them, then it will dull these blades very quickly. On average, I say anywhere from 30 to 60 inches of cutting, and you got to replace your blade. That's a general rule of thumb. It's not always necessarily true. It just depends on what you're cutting, the angles you're cutting at, and things like that. So, cut that piece out. So in order to attach this guy, as you can see, this helmet has an angle to it along here. This guy, I could curl him over, and he's not going to line up very well. Plus, this is supposed to have somewhat of an angle to it. So in order to get this guy to fit, let me be sure I got the right piece here, or the right side real fast. Yep, that's the right side. You're going to want to do angle cuts to make it square up with this piece here. Now, when you do that, this is not something you're going to get from the PET files usually. Sometimes you can follow the lines that they have for bends, other times you can't. Like this one here, a lot of times you can use these on the back side of the stencil to guide where to cut to make your undercuts that will allow the foam to bend along a nice smooth line. I'm going to do that on this one because this particular cut does need quite a bit of an angle. So I cut along the dotted line, and then I'm going to put it on the back side of the piece I cut out because that's where my angle cut is going to be. So I line it up like so. You can either trace it with a pencil or with the undercuts. I generally just run the blade very lightly across it so I have a score mark to follow. As you can see there, it has just a little depth to it. It's not much. This is where it gets kind of tricky for the new people. You're going to want to cut roughly halfway to 2/3 of the way through the foam, but not all the way. I'll go over this several times with the blade in order to get the depth I want, going very lightly each time. If you go too heavy, you have a good chance of cutting all the way through the foam. So I just run it down there a little at a time to take out the material I need. Then, after I've cut the depth that I need, hopefully you guys can see that. I'm using my phone for a camera. So after you get that, then we're going to cut a 45-degree angle out of it right next to it. So this is where a fresh blade really comes in handy. A good sharp blade will do this in one pass, no problem. And actually this blade is starting to get kind of dull at the end. So it's going to take me 2 cuts to get through this, I'm pretty sure. Possibly a 3rd. But as you can see, I've cut right next to it at roughly a 45-degree angle. So that makes a divot in there. So when I go to glue this in, it can fold like that. Here's it from the other side. And it will stay that way and make a nice line along here for your cut and for your angle. So that's just the first one. I'm going to need at least one more on this particular piece. Now there's nothing to follow on this one, so I kind of got to line it up and eyeball it. So I know what it is there. A lot of times I'll use the stencil itself to figure out where I need this other cut to be. So I'll line up the stencil there, take my pencil, which has run off on me. There it is. And I'll just get a good idea of where I want that cut to be. Right about there, make a little mark on the paper. And then draw a line straight down. Now, after I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that section of the stencil off, just like I did with the dotted line. Now, this one's going to be a little bit tricky because of the fact that there is that section missing out of this piece. It's a little detail section I'm going to glue in later, but I will show you how that goes when the time comes. So I'm going to line this guy up on the back side of my foam, make my score mark, so I have a line to follow. This is something that you're just going to have to practice at and experiment with in order to get good at it. Very few people get it on the first try. It's just the nature of learning to cut foam, especially with angle cuts. The craft foam, the only way I can really describe cutting it is it's a lot like cutting a marshmallow. It's very squishy, so you got to be firm, but you don't want to put a ton of pressure behind it. You just want to keep the blade in the same position as you go. So now you can see I have a couple angle cuts in here. When I go to glue this guy, they're going to make nice lines to line up with the other piece. So I'm going to look at this guy. He should line up fairly well, like so. Now, before I glue these undercuts to hold it in position, I like to attach the piece at 1 or 2 points so I know exactly, or so it lines up perfectly before I glue it along those lines. If you glue it along those lines first, your piece could have too much angle, it could have too little, and it's not going to want to line up, and then you got to kind of make a new piece. I mean, you can peel the glue out, but you risk tearing the foam, and it's just not worth it. It's easier to make another piece, especially if you're dealing with something small. So what I'm going to do is just a little dab of hot glue right on the end there. I'm going to line it up with this other piece and set that in there, and hopefully it'll cool rather quickly. Just about there. Now, after you have attached this piece to the rest of it with just your couple little spots of glue, what you can do is you can go back on the inside of the helmet and reinforce the seams where you glued it. What that'll do is that'll give it a lot more integrity. Rather than just a couple dots of glue, you'll actually have a solid line. A lot of people are against using hot glue. They think it doesn't hold up against temperature and things like that. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where during the summer, during our major con, it's not uncommon for it to be 100 degrees outside. Now, that means that hot glue can melt if exposed to the sun for too long. Well, I tend to be inside most of the time because it's 100 degrees outside, so I don't have a whole lot of issue with the hot glue melting. But you definitely don't want to leave it out in your car. I had a friend of mine do this last year. He left his suit in the trunk of his car, and the suit came apart because the hot glue sat in basically a metal oven all day, and the glue came apart and made an incredible mess. So there's where I have glued the seam across to attach that piece a little bit more fully, and then I'm going to glue this piece down here to this one and this one up here to this one. Then I will glue my undercuts to match the seams of this piece up here. So let that cool a little bit. I wish I had some air cans. The air dusters you can use to cool hot glue very quickly. There's a downside to that. A couple downsides, actually. The first being that the air dusters generally have a chemical in them called a bitterant. A bitterant is to keep people from using them to get high. It tastes incredibly bad, and when you spray your air duster around your room or wherever you're doing your work at, a lot of times the bitterant tends to land on just about everything. So if you take a drink of soda or anything else, you might catch a taste of it. The other really bad downside to it is that when you do that, a lot of times the glue won't get a good solid bond to whatever you're gluing it to. Because you cooled it so fast it didn't have a chance to kind of soak into every little pore and crack in the foam or whatever you're gluing. So that bond might actually come out a little bit weaker. So what I'll do a lot of times is when I use those air cans to cool the glue faster is I'll barely touch on them just to kind of cool off the outside of the glue. Just so the glue doesn't drip or make a mess and fall on other things. because hot glue can be very difficult to get out of a lot of things like cloth or carpet or anything electronic. Obviously, is a bad idea. Let's see this guy's okay. Now, I mean, the best option would be to glue these pieces together face to face. However, that can be a real pain when you're dealing with a slight offset. If these guys were flush together, I would go ahead and do that, but because they're offset in order to make the form of the helmet, I'm just going to be gluing on the inside of this piece rather than across the contact surfaces. With my other helmet that I've been posting on the forums and on the Facebook page, I did that a lot, and it worked out just fine, especially after you seal the piece in resin or Plasti-Dip, white glue. A lot of people use PVA white glue or Mod Podge to seal the piece before they paint it. I've been experimenting with a couple of different methods. For the longest time I used just Plasti-Dip on it, and that worked out alright. However, durability was a bit of an issue. I've had my current suit for a little over a year now, and it is starting to show some wear and tear. Then on a few pieces I tried Mod Podge and then Plasti-Dip, and that helped out a lot, and it also gave it a bit more rigid surface, you know, like metal, but not quite, but it did make it stronger. Plasti-Dip over the top of that. My current build that I'm working on, I actually picked up a type of epoxy called XTC 3D from Smooth On. It's used for 3D prints, and it's built as an adhesive. So when you paint that on, it goes on very thick. It's got the consistency of maybe a little bit thinner than toothpaste. It makes it very strong. It's not too brittle. You don't want to flex it too much, which is why I used it on a helmet and not on, you know, forearms or gloves or anything like that. But the really cool thing that I've been doing with it is that you can mix in a powder called cold cast powder. It's a metallic powder with the grain of about powdered sugar or so, that makes the resin appear and feel metallic. A couple of the test pieces I did on a helmet that was sized way too large, it showed some real promise, and I put the resin on there, and then I Plasti-Dipped over it, and then I sanded down to the resin to see how the Plasti-Dip would hold up against sanding. The Plasti-Dip held up alright. However, you need to be careful of how you sand. You want to do it all by hand, not with a palm sander. The palm sander will cause the Plasti-Dip to shred everywhere, and it will just peel off. When you sand through Plasti-Dip, you just want to move in a couple of directions and just a little bit. It doesn't take much to take it off, especially if you're using a high grit. I was using 150. The resin shows up underneath and looks metallic, so it looks like really good weathering. Maybe in the next video I'll show you guys what I've been doing there. But first I just wanted to detail how I'm making my helmets out of craft foam. So next I got to attach this side over here. This one's a little bit tricky because it has a little bit more flexibility to it, but if I hold it, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just put a few little dabs to initially get it, because the glue will cool a lot drier, or excuse me, a lot faster the less you use. So I use a couple dabs to hold it in place, and then I can put a bead of glue along the entire seam and let that sit. But in the meantime, I just want it to hold in place before I do that. So hopefully this will cool rather quickly, and we can move on to the undercuts. Awkward moment of silence. This is actually the 5th helmet that I've made out of foam, and I've noticed I get a lot better each time, significantly better. So it does have a learning curve, but the more you do it, the better you get at it. So those two little dabs are cooled off now and holding it in place where I want it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a dab of glue, or a line of glue, along this seam. And I'm also going to check to make sure these guys are lining up here. And I'm going to go ahead and glue my undercuts so that they hold, and I don't have to worry about the foam tearing where most of the material's been taking it. When you glue these undercuts in place, in order to be sure the glue gets down into the cut that you've made, you want to put your nozzle pretty close to the foam so that the glue actually gets forced down into that crack. So you can see it's not just on the surface, it's actually down in the crack of the undercut that I made to make the angles. This part's coming apart a little bit on the side here, so we're just going to hold that together while it cools off a bit. Do be careful when working with hot glue. I have had more burns from the stuff than I care to count. So if you're younger child or something like that, you might want to have your parents around for supervision. If you're older, try not to make the same mistakes I did and touch the hot glue while it's still hot. Common sense, I know, but you really wouldn't believe how often it happens on accident. And again, if you're using an X-Acto blade, then you should know what you're doing when it comes to a sharp blade. And hot glue, and being careful in general. So, I have that piece attached. I have it glued in. It's holding fairly strong. Now, this helmet doesn't need to be incredibly strong to start with. Once I coat it in resin, it will firm up a lot, and it will be much stronger than it is. So, I will move the camera in order to see the file I'm using, which the file I have is actually for foam, however it's not perfect, so I've had to make some modifications along the way. Those I can't really describe, as they're kind of as you go things, but I will do my best to show you with each video I make. Hopefully I'll be making more of these. I've never really done this, so we'll see. Alright, give me a second, I'm going to move the camera. Alright, so there's the helmet that I'm working on. And then this is the 3D pet file model. I'm going to move this around a little bit. So you can see this is the piece that I just did. And then there's the templates over there. Alright, so hopefully I'll make more of these, and see you guys next time.